The town of Millridge, Pennsylvania doesn't appear on most maps anymore. Not the digital ones, anyway. It exists in that strange American purgatory reserved for places the interstate forgot, where the population peaked sometime around 1962 and has been bleeding out ever since. 3,000 souls called it home in 1993. Maybe half that now. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, where secrets ferment in the humid summer air like fruit left too long on the vine. August in Millridge felt like breathing through wet cotton. The heat that summer was relentless, oppressive, the sort that made dogs lie still in the shade and made tempers flare over nothing at all. It was the summer the Phillips family moved into the old Garrett house on Sycamore Road, and it was the summer that 15-year-old Vanessa Hartley disappeared without a single trace. Vanessa wasn't the kind of girl who vanished. That's what everyone said afterward, as if there were a specific type for such things. She was a sophomore at Millridge High, honor roll material, volleyball team, church youth group on Wednesday nights. Brown hair she wore in a perpetual ponytail, freckles across her nose that darkened in summer, a laugh her best friend Kimberly Moss described as infectious. The girl next door in every cliché sense. Except Vanessa had ambitions that stretched far beyond the rusting water tower that marked Millridge's skyline. She wanted to study journalism at Penn State. She wanted to write for magazines in New York or Los Angeles. She wanted out. Her parents, Donald and Patricia Hartley, ran the town's only hardware store, a cramped establishment that smelled of sawdust and motor oil. They were good people, quiet people, the kind who attended every school function and never missed Sunday service at the town, at Millridge Baptist. Donald coached Little League. Patricia organized the church bake sales. They were woven into the fabric of that community so tightly that when their daughter vanished, it felt like someone had pulled a thread that threatened to unravel everything. The last confirmed sighting of Vanessa Hartley was at 6:47 p.m. on August 14, 1993. She'd left her shift at the Dairy Queen on Main Street, still wearing her uniform, a smear of chocolate syrup on her left sleeve that she'd been too busy to wash off. Her manager, a woman named Dolores Finch, watched her walk out into the parking lot, ponytail swinging. Vanessa climbed onto her 10-speed bicycle, the blue Schwinn her parents had given her for Christmas 2 years prior, and pedaled north toward home. The Hartley residence sat exactly 2.4 miles from the Dairy Queen, a straight shot up Route 44 that ran through the center of town before dissolving into farmland and forest. Vanessa should have made it home by 7:15 at the absolute latest. Patricia had pot roast in the oven. Donald was watching the Pirates game in the living room. When 7:30 came and went with no sign of their daughter, Patricia felt the first cold fingers of worry curl around her spine. By 8 p.m., Donald was in his truck, retracing the route. By 8:30, he was at the police station. By 9 p.m., half the town was searching. They found the bicycle 3 days later. It was discovered by a man named Eugene Watts, a retired postal worker who spent his mornings walking his basset hound along the old logging roads that crisscrossed the woods east of town. The bicycle was lying on its side approximately 40 feet from Route 44, partially concealed by underbrush, the front wheels still spinning lazily when Eugene pushed through the sumac to investigate. The Dairy Queen uniform shirt was draped over the handlebars, folded neatly, deliberately. Too deliberately. The chocolate stain still visible on the sleeve. No sign of Vanessa. No blood. No torn fabric. No indication of struggle beyond the bicycle's displacement from the road. Just the shirt, folded with an almost ceremonial precision that made the responding officer's skin crawl. The investigation that followed consumed Millridge like a fever. The state police brought in tracking dogs that lost the scent at the road's edge. FBI agents in cheap suits interviewed everyone who'd seen Vanessa that week, that month, that year. They polygraphed Donald and Patricia, cleared them immediately, then moved on to teachers, classmates, the creepy guy who worked at the gas station and had a record for indecent exposure from 10 years back. They dredged Miller's Pond. They combed through every inch of those woods with volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder in grim lines. They found nothing. The theories proliferated like mushrooms after rain. Vanessa had run away, some said, though she'd left behind her savings account, her diary, her college brochures. A drifter had taken her, others insisted, though no strangers had been reported in town that week. The most persistent rumor involved Jacob Brenner, a 19-year-old who'd graduated Millridge High 2 years prior and had harbored what everyone described as an obvious crush on Vanessa. Jacob had no alibi for that evening, claimed he'd been home alone watching television. Under interrogation, he crumbled, crying, swearing he'd never hurt her, begging them to believe him. They searched his family's property twice. Found nothing. Jacob moved away 6 months later, couldn't handle the whispers, the stares, the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. By Christmas of 1993, the active investigation had effectively stalled, but the FBI withdrew their resources. The state police reduced their presence. The case remained open, technically, but it joined that growing file cabinet of American tragedies, unsolved disappearances that haunted small towns and destroyed families. Patricia Hartley stopped leaving the house. Donald aged 10 years in 10 months. Kimberly Moss, Vanessa's best friend, developed an anxiety disorder that followed her into adulthood. Millridge tried to move on, the way communities do, but Vanessa's absence carved a hole that never quite filled. The years accumulated like dust. 1994 became 1995, became 2000. The Hartleys held a memorial service on the 5th anniversary, then the 10th. Donald died of a heart attack in 2008. Patricia followed in 2013, dementia having stolen her memories but never quite erasing the hope that maybe, somehow, her daughter would walk through the door. The case file gathered mold in a storage facility outside Harrisburg. Millridge continued its slow decline, businesses closing, young people leaving, the population dwindling. And then, in March of 2024, 31 years after Vanessa Hartley's disappearance, a cassette tape surfaced that changed everything. The house at 1247 Oakmont Drive had been vacant for 7 years before the county finally seized it for unpaid taxes. It belonged to a woman named Lorraine Vickers, a recluse who died alone in 2017, her body undiscovered for 3 weeks until neighbors complained about the smell. Lorraine had no living relatives, no will, nothing but a house full of garbage and memories. The county put it up for auction in early 2024, selling it as is to a young couple from Pittsburgh looking for a fixer-upper they could flip. Tyler and Monica Grant had no idea what they were buying into. The cleanup process revealed decades of hoarding. Newspapers stacked to the ceiling, grocery bags filled with other grocery bags, broken appliances, clothing with tags still attached. It was in the basement, behind a false wall panel that Tyler discovered while tearing out damaged drywall, that they found the box. In a cardboard box, unremarkable, the kind that might hold old Christmas decorations or tax documents. Inside were 19 cassette tapes, each labeled with dates spanning from July 1993 to September 1993. Alongside the tapes was a Polaroid photograph, faded but still clear enough. It showed a teenage girl with brown hair and freckles, gagged, bound to a chair in what appeared to be a concrete basement. Her eyes were open, terrified, pleading directly into the camera. Monica Grant screamed when she saw it. Tyler called 911 with shaking hands. The cassette tapes contained audio recordings, voice memos of sorts, a running monologue that spanned hours. The voice was female, older, speaking in a tone that alternated between conversational and coldly clinical. Pennsylvania State Police forensic analysts confirmed the recordings dated to August and September of 1993, based on ambient references, background sounds, as technological markers. A local news broadcast playing in the background of one tape mentioned the ongoing search for Vanessa Hartley. The woman speaking on those tapes was Lorraine Vickers, and she was talking about what she'd done. The investigators who listened to those recordings described the experience as profoundly disturbing, not because of graphic descriptions, there were few, but because of the casual nature of the narration. Lorraine spoke about the abduction like someone might discuss a hobby or a particularly interesting project. She detailed how she'd been watching Vanessa for months, noting her schedule, her routines, than the fact that she rode her bicycle home alone every Tuesday and Saturday after her Dairy Queen shifts. She described parking her car, a 1987 Buick sedan, along a blind curve on Route 44, flagging Vanessa down with a manufactured emergency, but claiming she'd hit a dog that had run into the woods. Vanessa, kind-hearted, trusting, had followed Lorraine into the trees to help find the injured animal, and that was all it took. A rag soaked in chloroform, a method Lorraine had researched at the Millridge Public Library weeks earlier. The bicycle dragged into the underbrush. The shirt left behind like a calling card, though Lorraine never explained why she'd folded it so carefully. Lorraine transported Vanessa to her basement. She kept her there for 17 days. The tapes documented what happened during that time, but even the seasoned investigators refused to release specific details. What emerged in official reports was sanitized, clinical, unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault. The phrase sustained trauma appeared repeatedly, a euphemism that carried oceans of horror. Vanessa Hartley died on August 31, 1993, according to Lorraine's own timeline. The cause of death was never stated explicitly on the recordings, but references to mistakes, to things going too far, to panic, suggested it wasn't intentional. Or perhaps that was simply what Lorraine told herself. The final tape, recorded September 3rd, detailed disposal. Lorraine wrapped the body in plastic sheeting, placed it in a large toolbox she'd purchased from Donald Hartley's hardware store the previous month, an irony that twisted like a knife, and transported it during pre-dawn hours to the abandoned quarry off Highway 22, approximately 60 miles from Millridge. She weighted the toolbox with cinder blocks and pushed it into the deepest section, water that locals claimed was over 200 feet in spots, possibly more. Then she drove home, cleaned her basement with bleach, and resumed her life. She never mentioned Vanessa Hartley again on any subsequent recordings. The remaining tapes in the box contain mundane observations about Lorraine's daily routine, her thoughts on television programs, complaints about neighbors. As if the previous weeks had been erased, compartmentalized, filed away in whatever broken machinery operated in her mind. The discovery sent shockwaves through Millridge and beyond. National media descended on the town like locusts, satellite trucks lining Main Street, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the Hartley house, and now owned by strangers who'd moved in 15 years prior. The story had everything producers craved. An innocent victim, decades of mystery, and a shocking resolution. The darkest corners of human nature exposed. But questions remained, sprawling and terrible. Why Vanessa? What had drawn Lorraine to this specific girl? The recordings offered no clear motive beyond opportunity and desire, two words that explain nothing and everything simultaneously. Psychological experts analyzing the tapes noted markers consistent with antisocial personality disorder, possible sexual sadism disorder, but diagnosis applied posthumously to a woman 7 years dead felt hollow, insufficient. Who was Lorraine Vickers? Background checks revealed a woman who'd lived in Millridge her entire life, 62 years in the same house inherited from her parents. She'd worked as a seamstress, operating a small alteration business from home. She'd been divorced briefly in her 20s, no children. Neighbors described her as odd but harmless, the kind of person you'd wave to without really seeing. She attended the search parties for Vanessa, walked those lines through the woods with everyone else, offered Patricia Hartley a casserole in the weeks after the disappearance. She'd hidden in plain sight, protected by assumptions of feminine harmlessness, by the absolute ordinariness of her presentation. Pennsylvania State Police coordinated with county authorities to search the quarry off Highway 22. The commercial divers brought in specialized equipment, sonar, underwater cameras. The quarry had been a dumping ground for decades, filled with rusted machinery, old cars, construction debris. The visibility in the murky water was measured in inches. They searched for 2 weeks, covering every identified anomaly, every shadow that might conceal a toolbox of the dimensions Lorraine described. They found nothing conclusive. Whether the toolbox had shifted in 31 years, become buried under subsequent dumping, or whether Lorraine's descriptions were inaccurate, deliberately or otherwise, remained unknown. Delays, Lee and Lunn, Beachboard, without physical remains, without forensic evidence, the case existed in a strange legal purgatory. They knew what had happened. They knew who was responsible. But the perpetrator was dead, and the victim's body remained unrecovered. Kimberly Moss, Vanessa's best friend, now 46 years old with children of her own, gave a single interview to a regional newspaper. She looked exhausted, older than her years. She said she'd spent 3 decades wondering if Vanessa was alive somewhere, living a different life, too afraid or unable to come home. She said the truth was somehow worse than not knowing, because at least uncertainty left room for hope, however irrational. Now there was only the knowledge that her friend had died terrified and alone, less than 10 miles from home, while the entire town searched in the wrong direction. Tyler and Monica Grant sold the house on Oakmont Drive at a significant loss and moved back to Pittsburgh. They couldn't live in a place where such horrors had unfolded beneath their feet. The property sold to an investor who planned to demolish it, build something new, erase the physical space where Vanessa had spent her final days. As if brick and concrete could be held accountable. The Hartley hardware store had closed in 2011, converted into a consignment shop that barely survived. On the anniversary of the tape's discovery, someone placed flowers outside the empty storefront, a small memorial that appeared annually now, attended by people who remembered or felt compelled to acknowledge what had been lost. But certain questions gnawed at investigators, details that didn't align cleanly. The tapes revealed Lorraine's meticulous planning regarding the abduction, yet she'd left the bicycle and shirt in a location where discovery was almost inevitable. Strategic? A subconscious desire to be caught? Or simply carelessness born of confidence that no one would suspect a middle-aged woman running a home business? The more troubling were references on several tapes to preparation, to previous research, phrasing that suggested Vanessa might not have been the first. Investigators reviewed missing persons cases across Pennsylvania spanning 3 decades. They found 17 unsolved disappearances of young women between 1970 and 1993 within a 100-mile radius of Millridge. 17 girls and women who'd vanished, leaving behind variations of the same anguish that consumed the Hartleys. Could Lorraine Vickers have been responsible for others? The timeline was possible. The methodology, as far as they could determine, could have been repeated. But the tapes only mentioned Vanessa. Lorraine's house, despite forensic examination, yielded no evidence of additional victims, no trophies beyond the cassettes and photograph, no burial sites in the basement or yard. Nothing. Nothing. Yet investigators couldn't shake the feeling that 19 tapes documenting 17 days represented only what Lorraine chose to preserve. What about the years before? What about victims she didn't record, didn't photograph, didn't memorialize in her own twisted way? The FBI reopened cold cases. They interviewed surviving family members of the disappeared, showed them Lorraine's photograph, asked if anyone recognized her. Most didn't. Most didn't. A few thought maybe perhaps wasn't she at a vigil once at a search party, but memories from decades past were unreliable, distorted by grief and time. One name kept surfacing in the investigative reports. A girl named Amy Thornton who disappeared from a neighboring county in 1989, 4 years before Vanessa. Amy was 14, similar physical profile, last seen riding her bicycle home from a friend's house. Her bike was found abandoned near a wooded area. No body ever recovered. The case went cold within months. Amy's mother, still alive in 2024, was shown the photograph of Lorraine. She stared at it for a long time, then said she couldn't be sure, but there was something familiar about the eyes. Just the eyes. Nothing else. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. As summer approached in 2024, Millridge prepared for an influx of true crime enthusiasts, the morbidly curious who make pilgrimages to sites of tragedy. The town council discussed installing barriers, prohibiting access to certain locations, protecting what little dignity remained. But how do you barrier a memory? How do you protect a community from its own history? The cassette tapes remained in evidence storage, labeled, catalogued, preserved. Occasionally, a detective would listen to portions, searching for clues they'd missed, connections they'd overlooked. The sound of Lorraine's voice, mundane and monstrous, continuing to speak from beyond death, confessing to crimes that couldn't be fully prosecuted, hinting at horrors that might never be confirmed. And somewhere in water too deep and dark for sunlight to penetrate, Vanessa Hartley remained, 15 years old forever, waiting for someone to bring her home. And the revelation of Lorraine Vickers' recordings didn't bring closure. That word, so often promised by investigators and therapists and well-meaning strangers, proved hollow in practice. What the tapes brought instead was a different kind of torment, the certainty of horror without the relief of resolution. Vanessa's body remained somewhere in the depths, and the possibility that she wasn't alone, that other girls rested in similar watery graves, haunted everyone who'd touched the case. Detective Laura Finley had inherited the Hartley file in 2019, 5 years before the tapes surfaced. She'd been with Pennsylvania State Police for 18 years, worked dozens of cold cases, learned to live with the weight of unsolved mysteries. But Vanessa's case had burrowed under her skin in a way others hadn't. Maybe because she'd been 12 in 1993, growing up just 2 counties over, riding her own bicycle through similar small-town streets. Maybe because she saw her younger self in those photographs of Vanessa, that same confidence that bad things happened elsewhere, to other people. When the Grants discovered the tapes, Finley was the lead investigator assigned to analyze them. She spent weeks listening to Lorraine's voice, rewinding sections, transcribing passages, trying to build a psychological profile from audio alone. What emerged was a portrait of profound dysfunction masked by absolute normalcy. Lorraine discussed her actions with the detachment of someone narrating a recipe. But she expressed no remorse, no recognition that she'd destroyed lives. The closest she came to emotion was annoyance when things didn't proceed as planned, frustration with logistical complications, this in the same tone someone might use complaining about traffic. Finley had consulted with behavioral analysts at Quantico. They confirmed what she'd already suspected. Lorraine exhibited classic markers of psychopathy. The recordings suggested she'd engaged in extensive fantasy development before acting, possibly for years. The abduction and imprisonment of Vanessa represented an escalation, the transition from fantasy to reality. And once that threshold was crossed, once Lorraine discovered she could act on her impulses without immediate consequence, the likelihood of repetition increased exponentially. But proving it required evidence they didn't have. Bodies, crime scenes, witnesses, something beyond speculation and statistical probability. The 17 unsolved cases they'd identified became Finley's obsession. She built a database, cross-referencing locations, dates, victim profiles, searching for patterns that might connect them to Lorraine. The task was complicated by jurisdictional boundaries, incomplete records, the reality that police work in the 70s and 80s had been far less coordinated than modern operations. Missing persons reports from small rural departments often consisted of a single page, minimal investigation, assumptions that teenagers ran away, but that young women left voluntarily. Amy Thornton's file was thicker than most. Her disappearance had generated significant attention locally, probably because her father was a county commissioner with connections. The investigation had been thorough by 1989 standards. They'd interviewed over 200 people, searched thousands of acres, pursued every lead no matter how tenuous. The case file included a list of volunteers who'd participated in searches, organized by date and location. Finley found Lorraine Vickers' name on 3 separate search dates. She'd signed in, walked the assigned grid, signed out. She'd been there, moving through those woods, pretending to look for a girl she might have killed. The realization made Finley's skin crawl, but it proved nothing legally. Lots of people volunteer for searches. Community involvement was expected, encouraged, considered a civic duty. Still, it established presence. It placed Lorraine in the right county at the right time. It suggested familiarity with the area where Amy disappeared. Finley requested permission to exhume any unidentified remains recovered from that region between 1989 and 1993. The request was approved, though it would take months to coordinate. Meanwhile, public interest in the case reached fever pitch. True crime podcasters descended on Millridge, recording episodes outside Lorraine's former residence, interviewing anyone willing to talk. A streaming service announced plans for a documentary series. Books were commissioned. The Hartley case became entertainment, commodified suffering packaged for consumption, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Some of the attention proved useful, though. A retired librarian named Phyllis Grant, no relation to Tyler and Monica, came forward in June of 2024 with information that had bothered her for 3 decades. Phyllis had worked at Millridge Public Library throughout the 90s, and she remembered Lorraine as a regular patron. This wasn't unusual in itself. Small-town libraries served as community hubs, especially for people without computers at home. But Phyllis recalled specific requests Lorraine had made, particular books checked out repeatedly between 1992 and 1993. Medical textbooks focusing on anatomy and physiology. Psychology texts about adolescent development. True crime books, dozens of them. Detailed accounts of serial offenders, abductions, forensic investigations. And most troubling, a book about wilderness survival and body disposal that Lorraine had checked out 4 separate times between March and July of 1993, the months immediately preceding Vanessa's disappearance. Libraries didn't keep circulation records that far back, but Phyllis had maintained personal journals, daily logs of interesting interactions, reference questions, notable patrons. She'd documented Lorraine's requests because they'd struck her as odd, the kind of pattern that triggered vague discomfort without obvious cause. After Vanessa disappeared, Phyllis had mentioned it to police, but the investigating officers had filed it as irrelevant. People read true crime books. It meant nothing. Now, with context provided by the tapes, those reading habits took on sinister significance. They demonstrated premeditation research, planning that extended back at least a year before the abduction. Lorraine hadn't acted impulsively. She'd educated herself, studied methodology, prepared systematically. The recordings confirmed this, but Phyllis's journals provided external corroboration, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as post-mortem fabrication. Finley's team expanded their investigation into Lorraine's background, digging deeper than the initial surface examination. They obtained her financial records going back to 1970, looking for unusual purchases, travel patterns, anything anomalous. What they found was remarkable only in its absolute mundanity. Lorraine had lived frugally, spent little, accumulated savings that totaled nearly $400,000 by her death, money that eventually escheated to the state when no heirs could be located. She'd never traveled extensively. A few trips to Philadelphia for fabric supplier conventions related to her alteration business. One vacation to Virginia Beach in 1984. Otherwise, she'd remained within a 50-mile radius of Millridge her entire life. If she'd abducted other victims, she'd done so locally, hunting in familiar territory. The team obtained Lorraine's medical records. She'd been generally healthy, saw her primary physician annually, no psychiatric treatment, no prescriptions for psychotropic medications. There were no red flags, no documented concerns that might have prompted intervention. But she'd existed completely beneath any radar that might have identified her as dangerous. Interviews with former clients of her alteration business yielded similar results. People remembered her as competent, professional, reasonably priced. Some noted she was quiet, didn't engage in the small talk typical of service industry interactions. But quietness wasn't a crime. Introversion wasn't evidence of psychopathy. That Lorraine had hidden in the most effective way possible, by being forgettable. The one person who might have known something was her ex-husband, a man named Richard Palmer, who'd been married to Lorraine for 18 months in 1978 and 1979. Finley tracked him to a retirement community in Florida. Richard was 78, suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease, his memories fragmented and unreliable. But he agreed to speak with her, and what he shared cast new shadows over Lorraine's history. The marriage had been brief and unhappy. Richard described Lorraine as emotionally distant, uninterested in physical intimacy, prone to long silences that stretched for days. He'd tried to connect with her, to build the partnership he'd imagined marriage would provide, but Lorraine remained sealed off, inaccessible. The breaking point came when Richard discovered journals hidden in their basement, notebooks filled with detailed fantasies about control, domination, causing pain. The entries were explicit, disturbing, written in Lorraine's precise handwriting. When Richard confronted her, Lorraine had responded with cold fury. She'd accused him of invading her privacy, violating her trust, claimed the journals were fiction, creative writing exercises that meant nothing. But Richard knew better. He'd recognized something broken in her eyes, something that frightened him on an instinctive level. He'd filed for divorce 3 weeks later, moved out immediately, never spoke to Lorraine again. He'd kept copies of several journal pages, though he couldn't articulate why. Insurance, maybe. Evidence of his reasons for leaving. He'd stored them in a safe deposit box for 46 years, occasionally considering destroying them, never quite following through. He provided them to Finley without hesitation, relieved to unburden himself of secrets that had haunted him for decades. The journal entries dated to 1978 described fantasies involving teenage girls, specific scenarios of abduction, imprisonment, the exertion of absolute power over helpless victims. The prose was clinical, detailed, organized like instruction manuals. Lorraine had been constructing these fantasies 16 years before she acted on them with Vanessa, possibly longer if earlier journals existed that Richard hadn't discovered. This revelation triggered a new avenue of investigation. If Lorraine had been fantasizing about these acts since at least the 70s, had she attempted anything before Vanessa? Were there earlier victims, girls who disappeared in the 70s and 80s when Lorraine was younger, stronger, perhaps more reckless? Finley expanded the search parameters, looking at unsolved cases stretching back to 1970, when Lorraine would have been 38 years old. The number of potential connections grew to 26. 26 girls and women who'd vanished without trace from central Pennsylvania across a 23-year span. Not all fit the profile. Some were older, some disappeared under circumstances that suggested domestic situations or voluntary departure. But 11 matched closely. Young, between 13 and 17, last seen in circumstances involving bicycles or walking alone on rural roads, bodies never recovered. 11 potential victims beyond Vanessa and Amy. 11 families who'd spent decades without answers, who'd grown old or died, still wondering what happened to their daughters, sisters, nieces. And the weight of those numbers crushed Finley some nights, made sleep impossible, filled her dreams with faces from old photographs. And the problem remained evidence. Suspicion meant nothing in legal terms. They needed physical proof, forensic connections, something concrete. The quarry search had produced nothing. They'd explored other bodies of water in the region, dragged ponds, searched abandoned wells, but Pennsylvania offered thousands of potential disposal sites, endless acres of forest, countless hiding places. Without Lorraine alive to provide locations, they were searching blind. Then, in September of 2024, a wildfire swept through a section of state forest land 30 miles northeast of Millridge. The fire burned for 8 days, consuming thousands of acres before firefighters finally contained it. In the aftermath, during damage assessment and cleanup operations, forestry workers discovered human remains in an area where the fire had burned away decades of accumulated leaf litter and undergrowth. The remains were skeletal, scattered by animals, incomplete. What they recovered suggested a young person, possibly female, deceased for at least 20 years based on decomposition and weathering. The bones were transported to the State Forensic Anthropology Lab for analysis. DNA extraction from skeletal remains that old was challenging but possible with modern techniques. The forensic team worked carefully, extracting samples, amplifying genetic material, building a profile they could compare against databases. The process took 6 weeks. In November, they got a match. The remains belonged to Jessica Brennan, a 16-year-old who'd disappeared from a town 40 miles from Millridge in July of 1991, 2 years before Vanessa. Jessica's case had received moderate attention. Investigation had stalled within months, her file eventually archived among thousands of other cold cases. Her parents had died in the intervening years, but she had a surviving sister who'd submitted DNA to a genealogy database years earlier, hoping against hope for answers. The location where Jessica's remains were found was heavily wooded, accessible only by old logging roads that hadn't been maintained in decades. Someone familiar with the area could navigate them, could transport a body without being observed, could leave it confident that discovery was unlikely. The site was approximately 8 miles from a property Lorraine's parents had owned in the 80s, a small hunting cabin they'd used occasionally. Lorraine had inherited the cabin in 1987 when her father died, sold it in 1994, shortly after Vanessa's disappearance. Finley obtained records related to the cabin, property tax documents, utility bills showing minimal usage, power and water connected but consumption extremely low. Lorraine had maintained the property but claimed she rarely visited, told the real estate agent during the sale that she'd never enjoyed hunting or isolation. But she'd owned it. She'd had access. And it was positioned perfectly to serve as a base of operations, a private location where someone could come and go without neighbors noticing, without surveillance. The team searched historical records, looking for any evidence Lorraine had been near the cabin in July of 1991. They found a receipt from a gas station 12 miles away, dated July 18, 1991. Jessica Brennan had disappeared on July 15th. It proved proximity, nothing more, but the circumstantial evidence was accumulating, weight adding to weight. Forensic anthropologists examined Jessica's remains for trauma indicators, marks that might suggest cause of death. They found evidence of healed fractures, injuries sustained weeks or months before death, consistent with prolonged physical abuse. But the bones couldn't tell them how she died specifically, whether from injury, exposure, starvation, or something else entirely. They only confirmed she'd suffered before the end. News of Jessica's identification renewed public focus on the case. Her sister, Margaret Brennan, gave an interview that shattered anyone who watched. She described 33 years of not knowing, of keeping Jessica's bedroom unchanged, of seeing her sister's face in crowds, of the hope that never quite died despite logic. She said the confirmation of death was agony and relief simultaneously. At least now Jessica could have a proper burial, and at least Margaret could stop waiting. But Margaret also expressed rage that Lorraine had taken even this from them, dying before she could be held accountable, before she could provide answers about why, about whether Jessica had suffered, about whether she'd been alone or afraid, or had known at the end that people were looking for her. The discovery of Jessica's remains validated Finley's theory that Vanessa wasn't Lorraine's first victim. But it also raised the stakes exponentially. If there were 2 confirmed, how many more remained undiscovered? The 11 potential cases Finley had identified suddenly felt less like speculation and more like probable reality. The team focused on the hunting cabin and surrounding areas. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, archaeologists trained in locating clandestine burial sites. The cabin itself had been demolished by the current owners years earlier, replaced with a modern structure, but they searched the land systematically, gridding it into sections, thus examining every anomaly the equipment detected. They found 2 more burial sites within a quarter mile of where the cabin had stood. Shallow graves, barely 3 feet deep, concealed beneath transplanted vegetation that had grown wild over decades. But the remains were again skeletal, scattered, incomplete. But DNA analysis identified them as 2 more girls from Finley's list. Nicole Strand, disappeared 1987, age 15. Amanda Porter, disappeared 1989, age 14. 4 victims. 4 girls stolen from their families, their lives, their futures. 4 confirmations that Lorraine Vickers had been far more prolific than even the worst projections suggested. On potentially 8 more waiting to be found. If the pattern held, if the other names on that list proved accurate. And the investigation became a recovery operation. Teams searched hundreds of acres surrounding the cabin site, working through winter weather, through snow and freezing rain, driven by the knowledge that families deserved answers, that the dead deserved acknowledgement. They found 3 additional burial sites by March of 2025, 3 more girls identified through DNA, 3 more families receiving phone calls that confirmed their worst fears, while simultaneously ending decades of agonizing uncertainty. 7 victims total, not counting Vanessa, whose body remained presumably in the quarry. 7 confirmations that Lorraine Vickers had been a serial killer operating undetected for over a decade, possibly longer. The true count might never be known. There were still 4 names on Finley's list unaccounted for, and the possibility existed that victims they hadn't identified, like girls whose disappearances had never been properly investigated or recorded, remained hidden somewhere. The question that haunted Finley, that kept her awake staring at ceiling shadows, was why Lorraine had stopped. The pattern suggested she'd been active from at least 1987 through 1993. Then nothing. No disappearances after Vanessa that matched her methodology. No victims discovered from the mid-90s through her death in 2017. 24 years of apparent dormancy. But Vanessa's death frightened her. The tape recordings suggested the killing hadn't been intentional, that something had gone wrong during the imprisonment. Perhaps the reality of a death, as opposed to prolonged captivity, had shocked Lorraine into cessation. Perhaps the intensity of the investigation into Vanessa's disappearance, the FBI presence, the sustained public attention, had convinced her the risk was too great. Or perhaps she'd simply grown older, her physical capabilities declining, her ability to overpower victims diminishing with age. Serial offenders often stop not from conscience, but from pragmatic inability to continue. The world would never know. But Lorraine had taken those answers with her, left behind only partial confessions and scattered graves, a legacy of destroyed lives and traumatized communities. By summer of 2025, the recovery operation had concluded. 7 victims confirmed, buried with dignity and ceremonies attended by families and communities that had mourned them for decades. Memorial services were held. Scholarships established in their names. Small towns across central Pennsylvania grappled with the revelation that evil had moved among them, wearing an unremarkable face, shopping in their stores, attending their churches, living an ordinary life while secretly destroying others. Millridge erected a memorial in the town park, a stone monument engraved with 8 names. Jessica, Nicole, Amanda, and 4 others whose remains had been identified. And Vanessa Hartley, whose body had never been recovered but whose suffering was confirmed beyond doubt. The monument became a place of pilgrimage, people leaving flowers, photographs, teddy bears, expressions of grief for girls they'd never known, but whose stories had touched something fundamental in the human psyche. Detective Finley attended the dedication ceremony. She stood in the back, watching families embrace, watching survivors find fragments of peace and acknowledgement and remembrance. She thought about the 4 names still on her list, girls who might be out there still, waiting to be found. She thought about other cases in other states, other jurisdictions, wondering if Lorraine had traveled more than records suggested, or if victims existed beyond Pennsylvania's borders. The investigation remained technically open. Finley continued working it, continued searching databases, continued hoping for leads that might bring the final missing girls home. But she understood, with the cold certainty that came from years of police work, that some answers would remain forever buried. That some families would never know. Some graves would never be found. The cassette tapes stayed in evidence storage, preserved according to protocol. Occasionally researchers requested access, academics studying criminal psychology, true crime authors seeking primary sources. Each request was carefully vetted, approved or denied based on criteria designed to balance public interest against victim dignity. The tapes had become historical artifacts, windows into the mind of a killer, cautionary tales about the monsters that hide behind ordinary faces. But to Finley, to the families, to the communities torn apart by Lorraine's actions, they were simply evidence of the worst humanity could produce. Proof that evil wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it wore cardigans and ran a small business. Sometimes it volunteered at search parties and brought casseroles to grieving mothers. Sometimes it lived next door for decades, invisible, patient, waiting. On the 32nd anniversary of Vanessa Hartley's disappearance, August 14th, 2025, Kimberly Moss returned to Millridge for the first time in years. She visited the memorial, traced Vanessa's name carved in stone with her fingers, and allowed herself to cry in a way she hadn't since they were 15 and the world made sense. The sun set over Millridge that evening, casting long shadows across empty streets and abandoned storefronts. The town continued its slow death, population dwindling, businesses closing, young people escaping to cities that offered futures beyond decline. But the memorial remained, and the flowers people left stayed fresh, replaced regularly by hands unknown. Somewhere in water too deep for light, Vanessa Hartley rested. Somewhere in forests still uncharted, victims might wait for discovery. And somewhere in the archives, a dead woman's voice continued speaking, confessing to horrors that would echo through generations, and a reminder that the worst monsters are the ones we never see coming. The case of Vanessa Hartley and the victims of Lorraine Vickers remains officially open. If you have any information regarding unsolved disappearances in central Pennsylvania between 1970 and 1995, please contact Pennsylvania State Police. Some families are still waiting. Some girls are still missing. And sometimes, even 32 years later, the truth still matters. Even when the truth offers no comfort at all.